All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar, Negotiating the Labor Contract, this month's GovInvest webinar, today, May 26th at 2:30 p.m. You know, contract bargaining and labor relations is one of the most complex areas of negotiations and dispute resolutions, and there are rarely clear-cut or mutually agreed upon notions of what a fair salary and benefit package would be. So employers and workers, individually and collectively, they often find themselves at odds, right? And furthermore, contract bargaining in a unionized setting is rarely limited to questions of just compensation. Things like you talk about, like our working conditions, safety concerns, questions about workers' rights. And in this post-COVID area, we have a lot more questions that are going to be addressed during the negotiations. So appropriate negotiation and dispute resolution techniques can help all parties engaged in this labor and workplace related negotiations achieve mutually advantageous and outcomes. So our guest speaker today for this webinar on negotiating the labor contract has worked on both sides of the negotiation table. In fact, we worked on both sides of the negotiating table together during my tenure at the city of Sausalito. So we're going to learn from him about labor's view of management and how that view of management from labor has transformed his experience now to management approaches labor negotiations, because you will learn quickly that now he is on the government side of the table. So today we're hoping that all of you will walk away with a comfort level of building trust and between labor and management. And you're going to do that through transparency. We're going to be providing some guiding principles and some policies and procedures. And we will have a case study as well. So let's move on and introduce our guest speaker. With me today is Paul Carroll. And Paul, I'm going to ask you to tell us a fun fact about yourself and a little bit about your background on both sides of the table.
Well, I started employment as a public sector employee, working in housing, and we ran into a situation where we had an executive director that was a little obtuse about employee rights, and we weren't represented at that time. So I helped organize the shop I worked in, and we became unionized. And that was probably back in about 1997. And then after helping bargain a county contract as a member of the union, they had a vacancy and I applied for it and got hired.
Wow.
And that was in 2000. So it's been a pretty interesting ride since.
And then from 2000 to 2012, was it that you worked on the labor side?
Actually, it was 2014.
Oh.
I worked for an SEIU local, which was small at the time. It was local 707 for 7 years. And then corporate SEIU decided that we should all merge, and we became 10-1. And I had represented county employees for the most part up until then. And all of a sudden they gave me a whole bunch of cities, including Sausalito. And that was in 2007. Within a year, the Great Recession had hit. And all I did was bargain contracts. And I had 15 jurisdictions. So one of the years I had 10 contracts open. So you can imagine trying to, I was doing 2 tables a day often. So that keeps you busy and you have to kind of focus.
That's for sure. And then when did you leave SEIU and go up to Sonoma County?
I basically a person that I had bargained against called me up and said that she was retiring and thought that I should apply for her job.
Oh,
She was a labor relations manager for the city of Santa Rosa. And after thinking a bit, I did. And I was hired right in the middle of labor strife. We had 2 bargaining units in fact finding, 2 that were about to go into fact finding, and they hired me. And it was interesting because I had never had the dynamic of working with city councils or any kind of legislative body before. And I had to kind of get up to speed real quick and figure out a way to craft something that would pass muster with city council and the unions.
right.
And it took quite a bit of time, but after about 3 closed sessions, I finally had a strategy that we were able to use to get closure on all of the MOUs.
Well, great. Well, we're going to hear about that strategy a little bit later on. So thanks for that introduction, and thank you so much for joining me today on this webinar. And for those attendees who don't know me, I'm a retired city finance director. My name is Charles Francis. This is a younger picture of me. And now, after I retired in 2015, I work with government technology companies. And I only work with government technology companies that I am confident that they can deliver on what they promise. And GovInvest is one of those companies. I was one of their very first customers in 2015. And their technology inspired me to give and provided me the data and the evidence to make some groundbreaking policy recommendations to my city council. In fact, the city of Sausalito was the first city in the nation to adopt a pension pre-funding Section 115 trust. So very powerful software. Now we do the labor costing, and we're also, as those of you who have attended recent webinars know, we also do financial modeling. And the city I retired from was the city of Sausalito, and that's where I first met Paul. So it's going to be an interesting discussion today. We've remained friends all these years, and I'm just delighted that you could join me today, Paul. Thank you. So let's get started with some housekeeping. Our next webinar is going to be on June 23rd. It'll be at about 11 a.m. Pacific, earlier than today. Our topic is going to be promoting social equity in procurement. Today, after this webinar, we'll be preparing a copy of the slide deck after the conclusion. There'll be a recording as well. And as always, for those of you who attend these webinars regularly, if you have any questions during the webinar, please chat it or put it in Q&A as we're talking, because we like to make this a dialogue. Paul and I today are going to be having a conversation. Yes, we will have some slides. Yes, we will be able to provide you some guiding principles and policies and procedures. But we want this to be a conversation. We want this to be interesting for you. So please participate. And if you have any questions after the webinar, you sit down, you have some time to reflect, you can please reach out to Max at GovInvest or any of the GovInvest team. We will provide our contact information at the end of the webinar. So let's just dive right in here. What's on our agenda today? Well, like I said, mostly a dialogue, asking questions, moderating a discussion with Paul. And I suspect Paul's going to have some questions for me as well. Then we will go into a case study from my last negotiation at the city of Sausalito. And if we have time, then we can cover with a bonus section where we can talk about some of the things you might be negotiating in a post-COVID world. Paul, are you ready?
Yes.
All right. So glad you are here today. When you were the representative for Marin SEIU, what was your overall view of management? From what you just told me, did you think all bosses were obtuse about labor?
No. One size does not fit all when it comes to different jurisdictions. Some are enlightened, some are not. A lot of cities had a long history of dealing with, unions. And so it was, for me, because I didn't swear at them, they were kind of very open and friendly, because the rep that had preceded me, she used to drop the F-bomb quite a bit. And so I went over really well because I wasn't a swearer. But each jurisdiction had its own kind of personality, including the union members as well. So you had to be aware that you had to tailor your approach based on the way the members felt about the city and the way the city government felt about the workers. So some cities, especially smaller ones, there was almost a familial relationship, and they thought of each other as all in it together. And as a union rep, you definitely didn't want to step in the way of that. But places like the Superior Court in Marin did not have that feeling on either side, and it was very adversarial. So labor has to kind of play the cards as they're dealt, in a sense, as you approach the different jurisdictions.
Very interesting. It's kind of, you answered kind of my second question then, which was, you didn't have an overall view that affected your approach to developing a negotiation strategy. In other words, you kind of crafted that view of management based on what you're learning at the table, what you're learning from members, like testing the temperature of the organization as well. So I guess, let me just ask, in your experience, did you find most labor negotiators took that approach, or were many like your predecessor?
No, that's the other thing, especially now that I'm on the other side of the table, you run into the same thing. There's quite a variety of the way people approach it when they're a union rep. The problem I'm seeing now is a lot of the younger union reps have very little bargaining experience. And their main experience is organizing the membership and not developing the relationships that made bargaining, during the recession possible. So that's one of the challenges. So yeah, you get the same variety, and you have to basically, in one day, you might have a very adversarial Zoom meeting with one person, and then have a very friendly meeting with another.
Okay, that's interesting. So tell me about some frustrating moments that you had with your members, and later on I'll tell you frustrating moments I had with my city council.
Okay. I got a phone call and it kicked into there. The most frustrating thing was basically during the Great Recession, a lot of the leaders amongst the members were people with high seniority. So initially they would come out and say, well, just lay them off. If they're going to do layoffs, let them lay them off. I'm not taking a pay cut or anything. And I go, okay, well, we're going to have to live with that. Let's live with that for a while before we respond to management. And I would let them kind of work next to the person that's going to be laid off for a while, because they all knew who the least senior people were. And over time, they finally would come to me and say, okay, as long as our hourly rate is not cut, let's see what we can do to meet management's, needs. And one of the things that I always made sure is that management needs had to be quantified. So management had to be transparent. I had to be able to see the budgets, the CAFRs. I had to figure out if they were squirreling away money. In Santa Rosa, we discovered that they were overfunding their vehicle replacements to the tune of about maybe $4 or $5 million.
Wow. So
they scooped that back into the general fund and were able to avoid some layoffs by doing that. So it's kind of it's a game, but it's also kind of building understanding of where you're at and proving your need from an employer standpoint. Mm-hmm. And if you can prove your need, then the employees tend to come along. The only place I ever had contracts not get ratified initially were in the city of Roanoke Park, which was on the verge of bankruptcy. And they wanted a lot. And I would, try to explain it. And usually the first go round, they wouldn't ratify it. And I sit down with management again, and maybe we would nudge just a little wrinkle, a little different way. And then boom, it'd ratify. So it was developing, the trust for management to know that I wasn't going to take that non-ratification into some sort of strike mode. And the other thing was that the employees trusted me to know that I was telling them what the conditions really were, because I could believe them myself.
Yeah. Paul, when I was sitting across from you, I used to sit and wonder how divided your constituents were. And part of the reason I pondered that is because I knew how divided my elected officials were. The city manager and I always wanted to approach negotiations with a fairness principle. Yet I almost had as hard of a time negotiating with my city council than I did with you. I'm curious, did you have to negotiate with your members? Was there conflict or division, or in general, do you find that most labor groups are unified when they're approaching negotiations?
No, it takes work. It takes work. You have to organize the membership in very real ways. When I would begin we call them campaigns, any contract campaigns, I would lay out the whole process for them, going through all the rules that PERB lays down, for California, around negotiations, and lay out all the steps, and that we would be checking in with each other throughout all of these steps. And some people at first didn't really want conflict at all. They were like, well, if you can do it without conflict, I'm good with that. And I go, fine, we'll try our best. And in Sausalito, we never had conflict, really. I don't think that unit suffered any takeaways except kind of the reorganizing of their retiree health. During the whole recession, there was no furloughs, no pay cuts, nothing. But
and I'll tell you a little story about that. It was 2009. I just started January 1st of 2009. And the city manager came into my office and he said, we need to open up all the labor agreements and abrogate them. We need to close City Hall 1 day a week. We need to stop capital investments. We have to look at furloughing employees. And I looked at him and I said, why? And he said, because we're scheduled to give all of our employees on July 1st a 5% increase. And how can we do that when all the other cities are closing City Hall, laying off employees, opening up their labor agreements. And I looked at them, I said, well, number one, we have to do it because we promised to do it. And number two, let's look at our fiscal condition and see if we can weather through this recession without closing City Hall, stopping capital investment and things like that. So I was able to put together a package that, and you remember this, that we honored. We did not open our labor contracts. We honored our 5% increase, but we communicated to our employees and through you that we probably will be looking in the next year's contract for 2010. We won't take anything away. We're not going, but we're not going to be able to give anything either. And that's what's going to get us through the recession. And I think that helped build the trust between labor and management that you were just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I think it built trust among the members, and it built trust amongst management and the city council. And that's until we got a cave person elected as a city council member, you know, one of those citizens against virtually everything.
Right.
You know, I think the last question I have here is rogue members. What maybe somebody wants to reach out to the press or reach out to an elected officials. If it's not part of your strategy and they go do that, how do you deal with that with your union members as the representative?
The only time that ever occurred was in the city of Fairfield. I was negotiating their contract, and what I didn't know was that the union president of that chapter, the chapter president, was talking to one of the city council members behind my back.
Oh,
and
wow.
not reporting that out to anyone, not to the membership or anyone. But he kept, we were trying to get binding arbitration for grievances, and he kept kind of waffling on that. And I didn't know why. And then finally, in front of the membership, he said, because so-and-so tells me we're never going to get that.
Oh.
And I was flabbergasted, and I started to say something, and he threatened me.
No, really?
Yeah. And so we kind of let that kind of go, and we actually moved a little bit towards binding arbitration, despite that one council person and despite the chapter president, but not completely. But yeah, it creates a mess, and you just have to kind of not overreact to it, but you definitely remember it.
Yeah, interesting, very interesting. So let's look at now that you're on the other side of the table, you take all that experience and you're the negotiator for Sonoma County now. How does all of those years of being the representative influence your style today, or do you still have the same style?
I still have the same style, but of course it's a little different because the dynamics are different. I always have, you know, I kind of learned through the interest-based bargaining process, and that process went away almost completely during the Great Recession because it just couldn't survive. But some of the style that developed as part of that, being mostly conversational in bargaining versus, you know, one person talk, another person talk, one person talk, another person talk. So allowing people to converse and kind of talk about their experiences and talk more about things kind of softened positional bargaining a bit, which I kind of have taken forward into what I do now. But the difference that I've noticed, and I noticed it when I was at the city of Santa Rosa, and I've noticed it with the county too, is there's a great deal of control exerted by administration over how far you go.
Oh.
Where when I was on the union side and I would get a proposal or a counter proposal my aim would always be, okay, let's work and try to get a counter proposal back to them in this session. So put it in their court so that, because I knew that they would have to go back and have it costed, run it up the flagpole with maybe the CAO or the city manager, with the finance directors, with and then eventually with council sometimes. Even if it was within their authority, a lot of times they had to do that, especially after the Great Recession. After the Great Recession, even though you might have authority, there was oftentimes pretty much, you still had to get blessings to go there. And I still think that kind of exists today.
So that's interesting. I never realized you were doing that to me, making me walk away with another homework assignment. So good technique. And you know, I wouldn't mind it today because now I have GovInvest labor costing software to be able to answer that question right there at the table for you. Oh, you want to add a wine stipend, you know, for because we're in Napa Valley. Okay, that'll cost an extra $3,000. Where's it going to come from? So that's interesting. You know, I believe, I really strongly believe that one person can influence the culture of an organization. Were you able to change the culture of the two government agencies that you went to in terms of how they approached bargaining before and how they approach bargaining now?
Definitely at the city, I did. The county of Sonoma is a much bigger kind of monolith, but I'm working on it. At the city of Santa Rosa, we stopped taking the lawyers to closed session. Oh. Because city council would ask them questions. And lawyers like to expound on options. And some of those options did not help to get to labor peace and close contracts. They may result in additional billed hours and potential litigation. So I told my boss, I said, we're not taking the lawyers to closed session again. We'll get their advice ahead of time, but we're going to package it to make it, in a sense, more intimate than it would be with a lawyer there. Oh. So that was a change I made there, and it worked.
Yeah, very interesting. As we were preparing for this interview, you asked me a question, and I have it right here. It was sort of like, with everything I know about how cities' finances are, how they approach negotiations, did I ever consider becoming a labor negotiator? And you know, the answer is yes. I've often thought that if I would have jumped ship, I could really help labor get better contracts, just because I know where to look in the finances. I can analyze data. I can speak the finance speak, and all of that. And I'm just curious how many of our attendees today have ever considered jumping over and being a labor negotiator and taking advantage of everything they know to help their members. So when I heard that you left labor negotiations to come over and help local government, I kind of viewed it as the motivation was you want to help people. And I think that's what I did too. I always wanted to negotiate what was fair for the city and what was fair for the employees, you know, because without the employees, that's our human resource is our biggest resource and most valuable resource we have. And I think, you know, the employees think without this income, without this job, you know, what else would I have? You know, because many times our what we do for a living kind of defines us as a person. So I think we're both motivated by the same thing, is helping people, but and especially helping people that against those organizations that don't have that same philosophy as we do. So the other question you asked me was, did I ever have a problem negotiating with my city council? And the answer is in the 2015 negotiations that you and I went through, was the most horrible negotiations I ever went through, not because of what labor and managed accomplished together. And I'm going to talk about it later. What we accomplished together was monumental. What the hardest part of that negotiation was negotiating with my city council, several of whom wanted to start taking everything away. And one of them who actually thought you could just, say, we're just going to opt out of CalPERS. So, they were just, even though they were getting the advice from the attorneys of what they could do and couldn't do in labor negotiations, they continued to hardball press. We got a question, Paul, coming in from Leah. She goes, how do you get a union to understand the financials? And she goes, we are struggling with them, believing we have all this extra money and that this should go to them for raises. They say, labor, that we are financially stable. But I believe, as the finance officer, we are not, due to pension and OPEB obligations of over $50 million. So I'm at a loss of how to demonstrate the concern of financial sustainability. I have an answer to this, but I want to let you jump in first, and then I'll chime in.
You basically, you have to work to convince them of the validity of your numbers. The problem with, OPEB is a real problem, because there is no plasticity to that cost. Whereas unfunded liability with like a pension system is more a plastic number, which means that if the pension system does well for 4, 5, 6 years in a row, your unfunded liability can drop considerably. But your OPEB costs are there. There's no way around it. And it becomes a real challenge to service that, for long term, especially because unless you're on a set dollar amount, if you're providing an actual benefit, those benefits have increased in cost dramatically. So your OPEB number keeps growing. And even those jurisdictions that were able to convert that into a flat dollar amount, it's still a substantial amount that sits out there. Now you have to report it. And all those taxpayer associations come at you and ask, why are you carrying this huge balance on your books? And it's hard, but actually kind of pointing out to labor what you have done is really important. And the other aspect is pointing out to labor what something actually costs, what 1% of a payroll increase actually costs when you look at retirement, when you look at how it compounds unfunded liability. All those factors come into play, and you have to spend the time to educate them, because like I said earlier, most of the labor reps have not been around that long. Most of the old guard that knew about this stuff have left. Oh. And so you're stuck with people that are about organizing, which means that they don't care what your data is. They're just going to organize because they think they can organize a contract and not negotiate a contract.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So let me jump into kind of my approach to having everybody understand the financials. transparency is what it's all about. Prior to 2012, there were not very many transparency tools in the marketplace. You could hang your CAFR up on a website and your budget, but those things are very difficult to read. Even GFOA award-winning budgets are difficult to read for the typical lay person. Things have to be brought down into common language. And there's actually courses out there to teach people how to talk, take complex subjects and turn them into ideas and concepts and visualizations that people can understand. So back in 2009, Leah, I immediately won trust with the labor group by refusing to open up the labor agreements and abrogate them. I actually told employees that we were considering that, but here's our financial condition. And back then, the only transparency tools I had was PowerPoint and a pointer stick, like Ross Perot, for those of you that remember Ross Perot with the big ears. But along the way, we would meet regularly with our labor force as citywide meetings, sit-down lunches. I would regularly go over the current fiscal condition of the city. And then when we sat down across with Paul in 2010 and said, no takeaways, but no increases either, we laid out our financials all for him. And then in 2012, when I got my first fiscal transparency tool, I really worked that transparency tool. In other words, I just didn't say, hang it up there on the site, go use it. Every presentation I gave, I pointed to that fiscal transparency tool and said, look, you can go here, you can validate this information. It's coming right from our audited financial statements, but it's a visualization that you can understand. Here's our real revenues, here's our expenses, here's our reserves. We're not hiding anything. That goes a long way to build trust. The biggest deficit in government is the deficit in public trust between government and citizens, between labor and management. For those of you who are on our webinar 2 webinars ago, GovInvest unveiled our financial modeling tool. That financial modeling tool is an internal and external transparency tool as well. It can be used to share information about your current fiscal condition on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annual basis. And you have to use these tools, actually hyperlink them into the fiscal impact section of your staff reports. Or when you're sitting down with employees and you're talking about fiscal condition, make sure you have a big screen monitor nearby so that you can point and say, and answer their questions immediately on the spot. And the most powerful tool that builds trust right now in the labor agreement is the GovInvest labor costing tool. When you have the labor costing, you have the pension tool, and you have our financial modeling tool, everything is open. We can answer questions instantaneously. It's not a black box. People understand it. And now, once we agree upon a common set of facts, then we can move to say, okay, how do we use these numbers to achieve fair packages for both parties? So love to show you, if you weren't on that webinar 2 months ago and you would like to see our financial modeling tool, please reach out to us after this webinar and we can explore that with you as well. And okay, there's no more open questions, but that kind of brings us to this next slide, which is there a trust approach to labor and management? Oh, let me get this out of my way. And where business as usual, there's a grown zone, a convergence zone, and a closure zone. So, this is a question for Paul. What are the benefits of labor management committees?
Basically, to kind of actually to clean up the chatter that can impact negotiations, because most labor management committees are not dealing with mandatory subjects of bargaining. They're dealing with what you can call the chatter, the issue here, issue there. This person's not being fair. This person's too strict in letting people take vacation. I mean, it's all this little stuff. that you really don't want to have to deal with when you're at the table negotiating a successor MOU on either side. Labor doesn't want that, and management doesn't want that. They want it to be as clean as possible.
So, I have this next question for you. And at the same time, one of our anonymous attendees posed us a question that's very similar. So let's handle them both at the same time. Any advice on how to handle negotiations with a very aggressive, parentheses, sorry to say it, but rude, close parentheses, field rep? We are a small organization. We all know each other by name. And the field rep brings an energy that does not exist at our agency. This will be another negotiation round with this field rep, and it took us more than a year to repair the division he or she set in place. We want positive negotiations with a fair resolution. However, under this person's guidance, we don't think we're going to be able to have that case. So what do you recommend now that you're on this side of the table and you've got that F-bomb field rep across from you? What are you going to do?
You basically reduce everything to writing, because dialogue will not work. They're going to turn any dialogue against you, or they won't even let you finish a sentence. I've experienced that. So you have to basically hand the paper. It's like old time positional bargaining. You have to go back to that. And hopefully sometimes the members get uncomfortable with the person's behavior. So you have to kind of be stoic. You have to deal with it on a paper basis. And because that one, it'll keep you in the good faith bargaining camp, because you're trading paper, so to speak, which is that dynamic in its essence. And but you're not letting that person basically gain any foothold by making you uncomfortable in front of their membership. So if that aggression by them does not work, then eventually the members might say, we don't want this. The other thing is, a lot of times these people have bosses. And a lot of these some bosses will embrace that causticness, but some don't. And so you can give them a call and say, you know what, we just want to bargain a fair contract, but we want to be able to discuss it. And we're at a point where we can't even discuss it. And that may resonate. The thing you don't want to do is try to go to the members of that union and divide them overtly, because then you'll have an unfair labor practice charge brought against you.
Right, okay. So, yeah, that's what I was thinking, was to say, hey, members, get rid of this person. But I mean,
yeah, you wish you could, but.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks for warning me about that. Yeah, I think leveraging tension and deep understanding, sometimes it's the first sign of bad behavior. It's kind of says, I go, wow, it sounds like you're under a lot of pressure. That's my go-to standing when people come at me and with an angry or contentious mode is, wow, it sounds like I'm feeling like you're really stressed right now, and then kind of get the conversation, and a lot of it's in tone and tenor, trying to calm down and saying that I highly recommend looking up the book, the negotiating strategy, written by Chris Voss. He was an FBI negotiator, and I've learned a lot from his materials on how to handle aggressive people. And if he was an FBI hostage negotiator, he was dealing with people like you just described. So Yeah, you reach out to us. We have some resources available from that author that we could share with you. So thank you for that question. Oh, it looks like we have another one coming in. Oh, just a great book. Someone commented that they also agreed with us that that was a great book. All right, guiding principle. Anything you want to add to the grown zone here as labor management committees kind of get to a place where they converge and start to work together and they're useful?
Well, you know, in negotiations, I always felt there was always that point where both sides felt queasy,
Mm-hmm.
where you were going where you weren't quite comfortable going. But that was actually almost always the precursor to settlement.
Oh, okay.
And it was because, you know, from a labor standpoint, you're agreeing to less than you really wanted. You don't know if it's going to ratify. You don't know all these things, and you're uncomfortable about that. But on management side, they're just as uncomfortable because it's like it's a quarter point more than our authority. I'm going to have to make a bunch of phone calls and all this stuff, but it'll mean we're done.
Good.
And so yeah, that the grown zone is that it's that weird space where you're both kind of queasy about the deal.
Yeah, but means you're close to a deal. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, real quickly, I'm going to talk about some of the practices that I use. The first thing that I would do, and I have this paper that we can share with the audience if anyone is interested in it. I would present a booklet to my city council. Negotiations for me began when the current negotiations ended. In other words, I was always in negotiation mode. And one of the first things that I wanted to make sure that guiding principles were throughout our agency. We will always bargain in good faith. I had my city council actually adopt my guiding principles. I wanted them to focus on recruitment and retention, set goals of fiscal sustainability, not just stability, but sustainability. We even went one step further and said we wanted to be resilient. You know, that the interest and welfare of the public was just as important, that these were all equal guiding principles. And we so believed in transparency, full transparency. And that's because with transparency comes accountability. And you can't have accountability without transparency. We wanted to be accountable to our employees. We wanted to be accountable to our interest and welfare of the public. We will always comply with laws, and we will always comply with the terms of the agreement. We will set forth what the priorities are. We will say, always remember that management does have rights, and then we use all of these to recommend contract provisions. And along with these guiding principles, I had policies and procedures. In other words, we wanted transparency in our negotiations. So there was always public meetings prior to negotiations, during negotiations, and before approval. Of course, we only were transparent about what we could legally be transparent about, but we involved the public as much as we could. We clearly defined what was the role of the city council and what was the role of the city manager in negotiations. And then we had parameters of contract negotiations, a calendar, and a costing of every proposal. I can't reinforce how important the costing of every proposal is. Even if you don't have a COIN ordinance, citizen openness in negotiation, please cost every proposal. You now have tools to be able to do that to the position and to the cost element. And what are those tools? Let me just cover them really close for those of you that don't have all of our software. We have calculate the exact impact on pensions of a proposal and on a particular bargaining unit. You can see that here's an example of my forecasting different kinds of scenarios. at the beginning of COVID? Are we looking at a V-shaped recovery, a U-shape, L-shape? I got tired of alphabet recoveries, but every one of those, we knew what impact that would have on our pensions. And when we knew what impact that had on our pensions, then we could also then put those assumptions from the pension forecast into our impact on our personnel costs. And for those of you that were on our webinar, financial modeling webinar, now we can forecast all of your revenues and expenses from each proposal and their labor negotiations, the impact on pensions, impact on personnel, impact on your long-term financial plan. And here's how I put it all together. Here's that labor negotiation planning workbook for SEIU and police officer agreements expiring on June 30, 2015. The table of contents. I went through and I kind of identified all the labor groups and their current agreements. And what was the summary of those? I talked about our pension reform and OPEB reform. I gathered statistics on all of this and demographics out of our workforce. We updated our compensation study and looked at CPI. We looked at our long-term financial plan, at CalPERS pension forecast, and then here's those guiding principles. Let me just click through to the document itself. And I kind of scroll through this real quick. So here's a summary of our agreements. Here's a summary of our workforce by workforce statistics, by KERS classification, by labor group, by job class. I knew what average salaries were. I wanted to be, and I shared this with labor. I said, when we're talking about it, here's what our workforce statistics really are. And you just go on and on. This data then became a document to the city council. Here was our updated compensation study, managers comparisons, laid it all out there. Here's the table of CPI. We can all agree on what it is at San Francisco, US, SEIU, police. And we're finally our long-term financial forecast. And then we put together from all of that information, we said, whenever you're doing long-term forecasting, you want to document the assumptions so everyone agrees on them. And then when we're through, we put together our package that said, here's what we're going to negotiate for this year. And so this kind of a document is just kind of essential to good negotiations and laying out the strategy in advance. And then here was our workflow diagram on how we were going to get to a successful negotiation, which Paul and I did. And it was a monumental success. All right, we've got 7 minutes left. Paul, give us what are you facing now? Return to work, coming back to the workplace, staying at home, mandatory vaccinations. What are we going to be facing here in the next?
Well, it's, in California, we're all waiting for the OSHA guidelines to come out. There's some new guidelines that are going to come out. The return to work, the thing that I know just from listening at the various labor management committees we have is employees are still scared. They're scared to come back to work. The interesting thing is in many departments, telework has actually worked. And the bizarre thing is in some circumstances, productivity went up.
Well,
and I think a lot of it was, there was a lot fewer discussions across cubicles, at the water cooler, in the break rooms. People didn't have people to talk to. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it made their psychological health better. It didn't, but it did make them a bit more productive. So that is kind of weighing into how we move forward with embracing a certain amount of remote work versus office work. And so we're going to be rolling stuff out in the near future addressing that. Mandatory vaccinations. that, I think that's on the horizon, because I think as we move towards fewer and fewer cases popping up, the need to know that your workforce is safe becomes more and more crucial. And the only way to do that is to know that they're vaccinated. Right now, there's a county, I think Santa Clara County came out with a guideline where if you can't prove that you're vaccinated, you're wearing a mask all day inside the office. And people that are vaccinated and can prove it don't have to. So it does create kind of a peer pressure environment to go out and get vaccinated, because wearing a mask all day is not fun.
Right.
And so it's kind of, but I think because of the importance of the delivery of services in all the various departments of government, mandatory vaccinations are going to start to kind of be looked at as a necessity. It's going to be a tough meet and confer, though.
Sure will
Really
be.
tough.
Yeah. And there'll be lawyers involved, and they'll all have options.
On both sides. Yeah.
And the only ones that'll be wealthy are them. So
Yeah.
anyway, let's get to our last slide, as we usually save time for questions. If anybody has any, sometimes we get deluged with questions, and sometimes we don't. We did get another question in of whether or not we would make available that document that I shared. And the answer is yes, of course. Please send one of us an email, and we'll be able to follow up with any other information that you might want. We have 3 more minutes left. Paul, do you have any closing comments for us?
Just that, negotiations are always a challenge, but unions are getting a little bit smarter. They do have people that they call them researchers, and they're the ones that are going onto the websites, pulling your CAFRs and budgets, doing very specific Public Record Act requests and requests for information to kind of get to know exactly what makes your jurisdiction tick. And then they channel that to the field reps who craft the proposals. The key element, though, is they're not always very good at what they do.
Yeah.
And they don't always read all the facets that impact things. So that's why you'll get those proposals that scare you. But you have to remember that, the way PERB, the whole act, the Myers-Milius-Brown Act, and all the different labor law that kind of follow that in California, at least, lends itself towards coming in big with a high cost proposal. Because if you're looking at 3, 4, 5 months of bargaining, you're going to probably have winnowed that down by 75% by the time you get to closure. So you never panic when you first do it. And likewise, management often comes in with significant takeaways that they have no intention of forcing down labor's throat, but they do it because of the same tricky dynamic.
Yeah.
They want to be able to drop things through the process so they can be claimed to be bargaining in good faith. And it's a tricky process. It becomes kind of a game, but you just have to be patient through it.
Okay. All right. Well, Paul, thank you so much for being our guest. And I promise I will not go to your most contentious union, bring the GovInvest labor costing software with me, and bargain against you in your upcoming negotiations. But I really enjoyed having you here today. Thank you so much. I know the GovInvest as a company appreciates you being here. And looks like all of our participants hung around to the very end. So thank you, participants, for coming to the webinar. Please follow up with any questions. Here's our email address and contact information, and we'll see you all next month. Thank you and goodbye.